imagine Donald Trump not just as, a politician or some celebrity.
Right.
But imagine him instead as a flashing check engine light.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, like a glaring, unignorable warning on the dashboard of the world, basically telling us that the global machine we're all riding in is tearing itself apart.
Right, and you wouldn't just smash that light with a hammer and say you fixed the car.
Exactly. You'd have to actually look under the hood to find the real mechanical failure that caused the light to turn on. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're inviting you, the listener, to just step completely outside the exhausting 24/7 political news cycle. We are looking under the hood.
And we have a really uniquely provocative diagnostic manual to guide us today.
We really do. Our source material today is this short, incredibly dense book simply titled Trump. It's actually a transcription of 2 lectures delivered back in November of 2016.
Literally days after that huge U.S. presidential election.
Yeah. Exactly. Picture the scene. It's right after the election. And this prominent, highly controversial French philosopher, Alain Badiou, steps up to a podium to deliver an analysis.
And Badiou is just a towering figure in contemporary philosophy. I mean, his goal in these lectures isn't to look at polling data or campaign strategy.
Right.
He wants to look at the election as a philosophical category. He treats the rise of Trump as a symptom of a much larger structural global crisis.
Now, before we venture any further, I need to state a mandatory and unequivocal neutrality disclaimer to you, our listener.
Yeah, very important.
The source material we are unpacking today is highly politically charged. Alain Badiou is a Marxist philosopher.
He really is.
His lectures offer a scathing, systemic critique that spares literally no one. I mean, he takes a sledgehammer to both the political right and the political left. So we want to make it crystal clear that we, your hosts, are not taking sides here.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing any political viewpoints, nor are we validating Badiou's communist or Marxist ideologies. Our sole job today is to impartially report on the text, dissect the underlying logic, and basically unpack the complex philosophical arguments contained strictly within these pages.
Yeah, we are essentially just trying on a specific philosophical lens. We want to trace exactly how a thinker like Badiou connects the dots from, huge global macroeconomic trends all the way down to a specific localized electoral rupture.
Exactly. We're here to understand the architecture of his argument, not to advocate for it. So with that framework firmly in place, okay, let's unpack this. To understand Badiou's view of Trump as a symptom, we first have to understand the underlying disease he diagnoses.
And he does not mince words here.
No, he doesn't. He describes the absolute global victory of capitalism over the last 40 years as a monster.
A monster. He uses that term deliberately, too, to describe a system that has just grown entirely beyond human control. To ground this in reality, he points to a staggering statistical metric from around the time of his lectures. It's the fact that just 264 individuals possess as much wealth as 7 billion other human beings combined.
Wow. That number is just almost impossible to visualize. 7 billion.
Yeah.
He argues it represents a greater imbalance of power and wealth than existed even during the absolute monarchies of the past.
What's fascinating here is the profound ideological shift Badiou identifies surrounding how we actually tolerate this reality.
Right, like how do we just accept it?
Exactly. Because during a monarchy, the subjects essentially had to actively believe the system was inherently good. They had to believe the king was ordained by divine right, to maintain social stability.
Like God put him there.
Right. But today, Badiou argues, global capitalism operates on an entirely different psychological mechanism. He calls it a negative consensus.
Negative consensus.
Yeah. Modern propaganda doesn't actually have to convince you that having 264 people in the world is a good thing. It merely has to convince you that any alternative is physically impossible.
It's basically the ultimate hostage situation.
Totally.
He's pulling directly from Margaret Thatcher's famous Cold War era slogan, right? There is no alternative.
Exactly. The ideological victory of this system isn't enthusiastic support, it's resigned acceptance.
Yeah.
You don't have to love the monster. You just have to believe that trying to slay it will result in the total collapse of civilization.
Wow. So let's look at how this negative consensus shapes us as individuals. Badiou outlines 4 possible subjectivities.
Basically 4 roles.
Right, 4 roles a human being is allowed to play in this current global setup. First, you can be an owner, like a capitalist pulling the levers.
Okay.
Second, you can be an employee and consumer, grinding away to buy and sell in the markets.
Yep, most people.
Third, you can be a poor peasant surviving at the absolute margins of existence, mostly outside the main flows of capital. Or fourth, you can be what he calls nothing at all.
And that fourth category is really the dark heart of his entire thesis. Badiou estimates there are roughly 3 billion wandering people in the world who represent a massive surplus of humanity.
3 billion? That's huge.
It is. These are people who are not consumers because they have no money, they aren't employees because there are no jobs for them, and they aren't traditional peasants living off their own land.
So they literally have no function in the capitalist machine.
None. They're just surplus.
I really want to visualize this because it's crucial. Imagine a massive global board game where you are locked into one of those character classes. The rules of this game are inherently designed so that almost half the players, those 3 billion people, are told they don't even get a piece to place on the board.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
They just have to sit in the room and watch the game happen. But I have to push back on Badiou's logic here for a second.
Sure.
How can a supposedly ruthlessly efficient economic system sustain itself if it produces a surplus of billions of people?
Right.
Like, why wouldn't capitalism just find a way to exploit them for cheap labor? Isn't that what the system normally does?
Well, Badiou addresses this by pointing out a fundamental limit of capitalism. It only creates jobs if those jobs generate a profit for the owners of capital.
Oh, I see.
If employing someone doesn't yield a direct profit, they simply remain unemployed, regardless of human need. He uses his home country of France as a prime example.
What's the example there?
He notes this absurd paradox where politicians were debating how to raise the mandatory work week to 40 hours for those who already have jobs, while simultaneously 10% of the French population remains completely unemployed and desperate for work.
That is deeply counterintuitive. I mean, a rational society would just distribute the labor evenly so everyone has a job and everyone works fewer hours.
Exactly. But Badiou is saying the system demands longer hours from a smaller, exhausted pool of workers simply because managing fewer people working longer hours is a more profitable arrangement for the owners.
Oh, wow. So the logic of profit maximization is entirely detached from the human need for purpose, dignity, or just survival.
Completely detached. And this produces that massive surplus humanity. The system doesn't view these 3 billion people as an untapped resource. It views them entirely as a security threat.
Like a management problem to be fenced off, policed, or ignored.
Right.
Okay, so that is the disease. An inescapable global economic monster that purposefully leaves billions behind. And because this system is viewed as the absolute only option, the political systems designed to govern our nations have essentially become hollowed out.
Which leads us directly to Badiou's critique of the traditional political establishment.
Right. He refers to the mainstream political apparatus as a weak contradiction.
Yeah. To grasp this, consider how a democratic system is supposed to function in the abstract. It requires at least 2 distinct visions for the future to offer the public a genuine choice.
Makes sense.
Badiou maps this out philosophically. You have the left, which traditionally represents universality, equality, and collective well-being. And you have the right, which traditionally represents identity, hierarchy, and national tradition.
But Badiou argues that in our current reality, the setup between the major mainstream parties, think Democrats and Republicans in the US or the mainstream coalitions in Europe, is a complete illusion of choice.
Total illusion.
They form a weak contradiction because both sides already completely agree on the fundamental, unshakable law of the land, which is the continuation of globalized capitalism.
Their disagreement is no longer about the strategic destiny of humanity. Their designated role, according to Badiou, is merely to manage the monster together.
Manage the monster?
Yeah. They represent opposing cultural or social views, sure, but they are terrified of sparking a true crisis. They maintain a quiet complicity at the absolute center of state power.
It feels like watching a hostile corporate takeover where the 2 vying CEOs absolutely agree to gut the worker pensions and sell off the factories, but they're throwing chairs at each other in the boardroom over the font choice on the new company logo.
That's a perfect analogy.
They debate the margins while the core remains untouched. But wait, let me ask you this. If the differences between the major parties are just tiny variations inside a global totality, why does the voters feel so incredibly polarized?
That's the big question.
Right. If it is all a weak contradiction, why is there so much genuine fury and tension out there right now?
Yeah. Well, Badiou's synthesis of this public fury is really profound. He argues that because this unified global system fails to provide any meaningful strategic vision for the future, because it offers no real alternative to the economic anxiety it causes, The masses are left drowning in what he calls an obscure disorder.
Obscure disorder. I like that phrasing.
Yeah. They feel intense frustration, fear of becoming part of that surplus humanity, and this vague, boiling desire to revolt. But because the mainstream politicians offer no real target or alternative, this rage has no clear direction.
It's like a society-wide panic attack. They know the engine is failing, even if the politicians in charge refuse to admit it.
And as the disastrous localized effects of this global market, lost jobs, destroyed communities, rising debt, as those become impossible to hide, the traditional political elite lose their grip.
The cultivated, polished professionals who usually run things just lose the trust of the public.
Exactly. That complicity at the center begins to fracture, and that exact hollowing out of the center is what paves the way for a rupture.
Which brings us to the main event. This massive buildup of obscure disorder, combined with the total failure of the central political elite to offer anything beyond the status quo, creates an immense pressure cooker.
And that pressure cooker blew its lid, producing Donald Trump.
Right. And Badiou categorizes Trump using a very specific and highly provocative term. He calls him a democratic fascist.
It sounds contradictory, right? But Badiou uses it to describe a very specific modern mechanism. A democratic fascist is a figure who operates entirely inside the established democratic apparatus.
Right. They don't orchestrate military coups or march armies on the Capitol like the fascists of the 1930s.
Exactly. They run in elections, they participate in debates, and they navigate media scandals. But while operating inside that apparatus, they play a completely different, violent musical score.
Badiou highlights Trump's specific use of language here. He relies on a discourse of impulse and vulgarity.
Oh, absolutely.
He uses late-night tweets and insults to produce raw emotional effects rather than coherent, logical arguments. He displays a deliberate, calculated contempt for polished rationality. And we really have to ask why that works so well.
Why does it resonate?
Yeah. For those millions of people drowning in that obscure disorder, the polished rationality of traditional politicians sounds exactly like the language of the managers who sold out their towns. So a vulgar, impulsive figure breaking every norm feels like a weapon being wielded against those managers.
And this creates what Badiou calls a spurious effect of novelty.
Spurious effect of novelty.
Because Trump sounds so wildly different from a traditional measured politician, he creates the powerful illusion that he is offering a completely new path out of the misery. But Badiou insists this is a hallucination.
A hallucination because the actual policies don't match the revolutionary tone, right?
Exactly. Just look at the underlying actions. The fierce protection of private property, extreme nationalism, tax policies heavily favoring the wealthy. Badiou argues this is just an older, more brutal modulation of the exact same capitalist path.
So it's not an alternative to the monster.
No, it is just the monster roaring a bit louder, stripped of its polite political manners.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Badiou completely reevaluates the entire map of the 2016 election based on this framework.
Yeah.
He says the true contradiction of that historical moment wasn't actually Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton.
Because Clinton represented the classic complicit establishment. She was the avatar of the center that was managing the burning car.
Right.
To the frustrated masses, she represented the negative consensus that things could never fundamentally change.
So Badiou argues the true latent contradiction, the actual clash of opposing worldview trajectories, was between Donald Trump on the far right, representing identity, hierarchy, and democratic fascism, and Bernie Sanders on the left.
Which Badiou says represented at least a faint, distant echo of universality, equality, and communism.
Trump won, in Badiou's view, because he was successfully positioned on the side of a true, raw contradiction, facing off against a weak, collapsing establishment center. The political board had violently expanded from 2 safe options in the middle to 4 dispositions, including the extremes.
That's a huge shift.
It really is.
Yeah.
So for you listening, think about how you perceive your own political landscape right now. Do you see the mainstream establishment as a complicit bloc, just managing the margins, exactly as Badiou suggests?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Badiou points out this is absolutely not just an American phenomenon. He traces this same structural symptom to figures like Silvio Berlusconi in Italy or Nicolas Sarkozy in France.
He describes these leaders almost as new gangsters, right?
Yes, new gangsters. They are political actors who actively exploit the inability of the traditional elite to manage the brutal contradictions of the global market. When the polished politicians completely fail to protect the public from the economic monster, the public eagerly turns to the loud, vulgar figure who promises to smash the system, even if that figure ultimately serves the exact same economic masters.
Okay, so Badiou has thoroughly diagnosed the disease, the monster of global capitalism. He's diagnosed the symptom Trump and the inevitable rise of democratic fascism from the ashes of a hollowed-out center.
Right.
But, a philosopher can't just leave us sitting in the wreckage of the engine block. If the old system of representation is fundamentally broken and the current populist alternatives are just hallucinations, what does Badiou believe must take its place? What is the actual cure?
Well, Badiou insists that simply resisting the current system is a dead end. You cannot build a future just by being anti-Trump or anti-capitalism.
Because resistance is inherently defensive.
Exactly. You must affirm a new beginning. You need what he simply calls a new idea. And for Badiou, this means returning to the core of the communist hypothesis.
Now, acknowledging, again, the heavily loaded historical baggage of that phrase, Badiou tries to strip it down to its absolute philosophical studs. He outlines 4 specific principles that he believes must form the foundation of any new political idea.
And he doesn't present these as a list of demands, but as an interconnected way of reorganizing human life.
It starts at the economic root. The first principle is collectivism against private property.
And this isn't just about state ownership. It's a fundamental rejection of the idea that monstrous, privatized hoarding of wealth is a natural human necessity.
Right. It's the assertion that society can actually be organized around collective need rather than the dictates of private wealth accumulation.
But if you change the economics, you have to change daily life. Which brings us to his second principle, polymorphous work against specialization.
Polymorphous work, that's a mouthful.
It is, but it fundamentally challenges how we view human value. Badiou wants to shatter the deeply ingrained division between what we consider noble work, like intellectual labor, management, or government, and manual labor.
Because how does a society function if the person drafting the laws also has to help sweep the streets or assemble the plumbing?
Exactly. Badiou believes a true society reconciles human beings at the level of daily work. If you break down those rigid specializations, you immediately begin to dissolve the class divisions that create the surplus humanity we talked about earlier.
Which naturally leads to the question of who gets to participate in this new society. His third principle is concrete universalism against closed identities.
This is a direct attack on the rhetoric of the far right.
Yeah. Badiou argues that true equality must exist across all differences. Differences in race, religion, gender, or nationality cannot be an obstacle. He firmly rejects borders, racism, and the cult of closed national identities.
Because if we are all workers sharing the labor, borders become exposed as merely an artificial mechanism used by the capitalist class to divide and control that labor.
True politics for Badiou must be universal to all humanity, not just citizens of a specific patch of dirt.
And finally, who manages all of this? His fourth principle is free association against the state.
Right, because Badiou argues the state itself is the ultimate manager. True politics means shedding the manager.
It is the idea that people should be able to directly manage their own lives, their own workplaces, and their futures through free association and local meetings.
Without needing a massive, armed, separated power dictating down to them from above. So what does this all mean?
Good question.
If a modern listener, someone tuning in right now, who is deeply frustrated with the political status quo and actually wants to be active, here's these 4 highly philosophical, frankly utopian-sounding principles. How are they supposed to actually use them? I mean, you can't exactly walk into a voting booth on a Tuesday and pull a lever for polymorphous work.
Right, no, you can't. But Badiou explicitly states that these principles are not meant to be a finalized, concrete party platform. Instead, she intends them to be used as a protocol of judgment.
A protocol of judgment.
Yeah, think of it as a political compass for your own mind.
Oh, I see. So when a new policy is proposed, or a new social movement emerges in the streets, or a politician makes a grand promise, you hold it up against the 4 principles.
Exactly. You ask yourself the hard questions. Does this specific action move us toward collectivism and away from extreme wealth hoarding?
Does it break down the barriers between different classes of workers?
Right. Does it promote universal equality regardless of identity or borders?
Does it give everyday people more direct control over their lives rather than relying on state power?
If the answer is yes, it is a good step, worthy of support. If the answer is no, it is a bad one, likely just another trick of the existing system.
That makes a lot of sense.
It provides that strategic orientation, that true north, that the frustrated masses drowning in obscure disorder are currently missing. It gives you a way to measure whether a movement is actually fixing the engine or just trying to paint the car a different color.
Wow. Okay, let's briefly recap the intense journey we've been on today. We started by looking at Badiou's diagnosis of global capitalism as a runaway monster that actively produces billions of people as surplus humanity.
We explored how traditional mainstream politics has been reduced to a weak complicity, managing the margins while failing to offer a real vision.
We saw how that vacuum created the pressure cooker that produced Donald Trump, whom Badiou views as a democratic fascist. Basically a loud, vulgar symptom of a broken system, rather than a true structural alternative.
And finally, we unpacked Badiou's 4 principles for a new political idea designed to serve as a compass for judging future action.
And again, to remind you, our listener, this has been an exploration of Alain Badiou's specific Marxist philosophical framework. Our goal today wasn't to convert you, but to hand you a different pair of binoculars to view the political landscape.
And as we close, there is one final, incredibly provocative thought drawn from the Q&A portion of Badiou's lectures that really lingers.
Oh, what's that?
Well, when asked about how to actually implement this new idea in the real world, Badiou issues a stark, agonizing warning about the mechanics of political change. He notes that creating a new strategy is incredibly difficult because, in his words, the state always has time on its side.
The state always has time on its side.
The state is patient, it is continuous, it has funded institutions, endless bureaucracy, and a standing military. Conversely, mass movements, street protests, even massive societal revolts, they are inherently temporary phenomena.
That's true.
Think about the life cycle of a protest. There is the thrill of the march, the tear gas, the chant, but eventually Monday morning arrives.
The passion fades.
Exactly. People have to go home, rent is due, they have to go back to work to feed their families. The movement naturally dissipates, but the state remains, simply waiting out the storm, ready to reassert control the moment the streets clear.
That is a chilling realization for anyone who has ever participated in a massive protest and wondered why the deeply entrenched system didn't fundamentally change the very next day. So we leave you, the listener, with this final thought to mull over as you go about your day. If you recognize that the check engine light is flashing red and you truly want to change a failing global system, how do you build a movement that can actually outlast the endless grinding patience of the state?
It's a heavy question.
It really is. And perhaps more importantly, how do you sustain that organization without it eventually becoming the very oppressive power you set out to destroy in the first place? Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.